Welcome to the 4Simmers 7879 for MSFS. This airplane is available on the Marketplace for £10 and shares its systems with the default 787. Until recently, those default systems were awful, and as a result, this airplane currently has a 2-star rating. However, since working title reworked the default Boeing avionics, it should have improved. Join me on a full flight as I evaluate this airplane. So I've chosen a runway start, engines on, and I've already planned a flight in the world map. We're just going to head down and set up the FMC, which correctly identifies the airplane as a 7879. The process is identical to setting up the default 787 or the Coro 7878. You double click 0 fuel weight, reserves you have to feed in manually, insert your cruising altitude, you choose your cost index. This setup is exactly as seen in the other two variants. And you then set your flaps to match the value that's either in your flight plan or that's already set in the simulator. So it's flaps 15 for this one. CG is a double click, and then you commit the V-speeds by clicking on the right hand side. All very, very familiar if you've flown either the default or the Kuro. Flight planning is again based on the working title system, so if you've flown at default or the Kuro, you'll have an identical experience here. The legs page automatically pulls through the flight plan that you made in the world map. It has the same routing engine, so you'll experience the same discontinuities on certain routes, which you can clear out in exactly the same way as we're doing here. But it's very straightforward to get a full flight plan from runway to runway. Auto brakes are configured to RTO by default, and the spoilers are unarmed by default, so that's all set for takeoff. As you might expect, if you've flown either of the other two variants, you'll need to adjust your pitch trim before takeoff to get that into the correct range. Heading over to the Autopilot panel, we'll see Flight Director, Auto Throttle are already armed, so we click LNAV, VNAV, and see the buttons look slightly different to the other two variants. I think this is a slightly older model of the cockpit. Dial in the cruising altitude. Our route is all set, the airplane is configured, and we're ready to go. So, as we are on the runway, take the parking brake off and apply full throttle. For some reason the rudder is ridiculously sensitive on this variant. Rotate at the rotate speed. It doesn't kind of pitch up as the other variants do, so you really have to pull back on the yoke to get it to take flight. But otherwise it's very stable during takeoff, and at 400 feet you can hand over to the autopilot. The airplane exhibits the proper VNAV climb behaviour, so roll off the flaps as the speed increases, and the airplane will head up to 250 knots below 10,000 feet. And we can also see that just like the other 787s with working title systems, this variant also obeys altitude constraints along your route. So you can see we've reached here an altitude constraint of 5,000 feet, which the airplane is obeying, and then as soon as the airplane passes that constraint, heads to the next waypoint, it does continue its climb automatically. And we can see that top of climb is correctly marked on the navigation display just ahead of us. So at top of climb the airplane does level off as it should, and you get the VNAV path annunciator. And if we go over to the VNAV page of the FMC, you can see a predicted time to top of descent and the distance to the top of descent, which is all correct. So on the legs page, as always, as I do at top of climb, I'm going to find my final waypoint altitude for my bottom of descent, and I'm going to dial that into the autopilot panel. I'll dial in 2000 because as long as you pick an altitude that's equal or below, it will all work correctly. And because we've got VNAV enabled, the airplane will maintain 26,000 feet until its top of descent, at which point it will automatically begin a VNAV descent to our bottom of descent altitude, 2,400, which should line us up for the ILS quite nicely. And we can see top of descent is correctly displayed on the navigation display towards the end of our flight plan. I continue to work through my usual checklist at top of climb, so I'll get the auto brakes ready for the approach, and I'll also get the spoilers armed, although as we'll find out later on, I've done that slightly prematurely in this airplane. On the initialize page, of course, we get the approach ref page now, so I'll pick the approach config of 30 degrees and 139 knots, and I'll paste that into a flap speed box. Top of descent arrives, and as you'd expect and hope, the airplane does bring the throttles to idle, pitch the nose down, and automatically begin its VNAV descent. Because I selected a runway in my flight plan, the ILS and course for that runway has automatically appeared in the nav radio page of my FMC. As with all planes based on working title systems, if for some reason it hasn't appeared, or you select your runway in flight or towards the end of your flight, you can manually dial in that ILS frequency and course.
Descend and maintain flight level 180 all Nippon 112
So as we get close to the destination and we enter the deceleration phase of flight, we do apply the flaps as the airplane slows down, but this is where things start to fall apart somewhat. The airplane, for some reason, is very slippery and does not want to decelerate even with an idle throttle. So we had to put the speed brakes all the way extended to get the airplane into a configuration where it would actually decelerate. We could apply full flaps and drop the landing gear. Of course, once it's in that config, we could roll off the spoilers, return them to arms. Okay, so now time for the approach phase. So we're about to turn on to final. I'll activate the localizer mode of the airplane, and as soon as the airplane is established on the localizer, we get that localizer annunciator on the PFD. At this point, I'll hit approach, and the airplane should hopefully also pick up the glide slope, which you can see right there on the PFD. So far, so good. And as with all planes based on the working title Boeing systems, the default configuration is both autopilots armed for an automatic landing. However, it's during this final approach phase that we encounter probably the biggest issue with this airplane. In this sped up clip here, we can see it just endlessly wandering on the localizer. Eventually it gets bored of following it and just begins a 180-degree turn. The bigger problem with that is that while it's facing away from the runway, it's actually still descending on the glide slope. I'm going to take over manually here. Okay, so I've turned the plane around, I've put it back on a heading that faces towards the runway, and I'm currently flying the approach manually. You just cannot trust the approach modes in this plane, in my experience. So what you're about to see is an entirely manual landing. I kept the auto throttle on until the last minute, because that seems pretty solid, but then switched it off, idled the throttle, and landed the airplane. Reverses upon touchdown worked just fine, but you can see that super sensitive rudder in action again once more. This concludes our review flight. The 4Simmers 787 is definitely a 2-star airplane in my opinion, because of the odd slippiness during descent and that broken approach mode. My recommendation is to fly the default 787-10 or the free Kuro 787-8 instead. Thanks for watching, please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.